Hello and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Please sign up at my Patreon to get episodes earlier, bonuses, to have a say on future content, and to interact with me and other Warbirders directly. But mainly you'll have the satisfaction of helping keep this podcast going. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17, or even just drop me a review. Thank you for your support. Now on to the show. Hello, Warbirders. And before we get into the part 2 of the Jug P-47, I want to wish everybody a Happy New Year. All the best for 2026. And to thank all of you for listening and commenting and sending me those PayPal tips, and my Patreon members. I'm so grateful for this community that we've built and what we share. And, well, I'm not going to go on too long, so let's dive in and get to it. Where we paused last time was that the high and mighty P-47 had built a career on bouncing enemy fighters at altitude and then roaring down to strafe airfields, trains, and aircraft on the ground. All the while eating flak that would have seriously troubled other Allied fighters. And the Jugs had a new friend to help in clearing out the Luftwaffe. The new little P-51 Mustangs were even better at cutting even deeper into Germany, and the Jugs were to get a new role: ground attack. Before we get into that, let's look at some P-47 variants. If this whole series has had a constant theme at all, it's been evolution. From the P-35 to the P-34 and finally to the Jug. But the evolution did not stop there. Improvements were constant throughout the production run of the aircraft and would have even continued if someone had kept ordering Thunderbolts. So the B model was the initial run, and the C was the main one to go to war. On October 14th, 1941, the US AAF ordered an additional 850 P-47s, and so a new Republic plant in Evansville, Indiana, was brought online to help out with production. These models were the P-47D Razorbacks. They incorporated many of the design changes I've described before, including the new props and plumbing for drop tanks. But there was plenty of tinkering going on even within the D variant, and even between the aircraft built at the different factories. If an experiment in one plant worked out, then the other would take it up. But tweaks along the way were such things as adding extra cowl flaps for better engine cooling, changing turbocharger shrouds, adding and then improving the shackles for bombs or drop tanks, adding wet underwing pylons, changing the canopy to be jettisonable, adding internal fuel capacity to 375 US gallons, and adding a water methanol injection system to the engine. And even with 2 factories, there was still an insufficient supply of Thunderbolts. Curtiss-Wright was brought on to help. They had built a factory in Buffalo, New York, for the construction of its upgrade to the P-40 Warhawk, which was called the P-60A. That contract had been cancelled, so they were awarded another to build P-47Gs. Curtiss-Wright built 354 P-47Gs until March 1944. They even built a few 2-seat TP-47G trainers, which were known playfully as double bolts. Now, there was one complaint from P-47 pilots that has not been addressed yet at all. And that one was that the Razorback cockpit configuration had limited rearward visibility. Eventually, it wasn't enough to say that the P-47 could just dive away from every threat, so it didn't matter what was back there. So, to see what could be done, Republic borrowed a bubble canopy from a Hawker Typhoon and slapped it on a P-47D in July 1943 and called it an XP-47K. It was a great success. Now, somewhat strangely, this pretty major change, which even the most rookie warbirder can spot, didn't get a new variant letter. They were just known as bubble top P-47Ds. Of the total 15,600 P-47s built, 3,028 were bubble tops. There were a few other oddball variants, like the RP-47B, which was a photo reconnaissance version with cameras added. There was a single prototype for an even higher altitude variant known as the XP-47E. It had a pressurized cockpit with a hinged canopy, but it was cancelled as the emphasis on the P-47 had shifted from upstairs to downstairs. But more on that later. The XP-47F had a larger laminar flow wing. It was tested, crashed, and never replaced. Now, even the powerful and speedy P-47 was beginning to appear pokey with the advent of the jet and rocket fighters such as the Messerschmitt Me-262 and Me-163 Comet. So Republic went to work to make an even speedier Thunderbolt. They upgraded the engine to a 2,800 horsepower R2800-57C and improved the propeller again, raising the top speed to 473 miles per hour. Only about 130 P-47Ms were built, and engine problems delayed their combat debut until only a few weeks before the end of the war in Europe. The P-47N, as in November, was built for the war in the Pacific, where range was even more of an issue. So Republic took a YP-47M and lengthened and squared off the wings. They also returned to the old idea of the wet wing, turning the whole inside of the wing into a fuel tank, and called it the P-47N. 1,816 were built, and I guess they solved the leaking problem because I didn't see any evidence of that. There are a couple more interesting variants, but you'll have to stick around until the end of the story for those. So, before we broke away to speak of variants, I had mentioned that the P-47 had a new friend in the P-51 Mustang. I've mentioned before that I work in education as my day job, and we always notice a shuffling of the friend groups around grade 9. Kids who were the best pals in the early years of high school suddenly swap groups as some head off in the science path and others towards liberal arts. And although there's no rule stating that a science kid can't hang out with an arts kid, let's just say that birds of a feather study together. And all of this can be monkey-wrenched if a new and popular kid transfers in. Anyway, I was put in mind of this phenomenon when I looked at the evolving U.S. fighter situation. The P-38s and P-47s had started off the conflict, but over time, the P-38 numbers had declined in Europe, and they had headed off to where they were more effective. Kind of like the science kids. Of course, something that had totally upset the little friend groups was the new kid on the block that had transferred in. That, of course, was the P-51. As it was discovered that the P-51s actually had the range that everyone had wanted the P-47 to have, there was a shifting of roles. The increased range hadn't really come with any significant disadvantage to the P-51. It was a dogfighter that could actually get all the way there and back, and there were even other advantages that maybe aren't as sexy as dogfighting performance, but were war-winning factors. The P-51 cost about half that of a P-38, and a third less than a P-47, and took significantly fewer man-hours to produce. This means that you can have more of them, and in war, quantity has a quality all of its own. So as time went on and more Mustangs arrived on the scene, more and more fighter groups transferred over to the nimble filly with the long legs. What was the P-47 to do? Well, it was about to undergo a shift in role about as significant as one of my science kids, tossing away their chemistry and physics books and heading to shop class. This fighter, which was specifically designed as a high-altitude machine, was going to head to ground-pounding school. For although that turbo supercharger was there specifically for the Thunderbolt to go high, much of the rest of the fighter's attributes made it great for down low. Its rugged airframe allowed it to shrug off punishment that would cripple a lighter fighter. Its big air-cooled radial engine, thick armor plate, and cavernous fuselage gave it unbelievable survivability. Without adding or changing anything, the 8 Brownings in the wings, with about 340 to 425 rounds per gun, already gave the P-47 the densest 50 caliber battery of any American fighter. On the ground, that meant it literally shredded trucks and half-tracks, cut locomotives in half, disabled tanks by destroying tracks, optics, or engine decks, and swept infantry columns with a devastating hail of fire. Pilots said that the guns made a sound like tearing a bedsheet, a long, angry rip across the ground. Then, once Republic added hardpoints and wing pylons, the P-47 could haul the same weight of ordnance that a B-17 could on a long-range mission. 500-pound M64 general-purpose bombs and 1,000-pound M65 general-purpose bombs were its typical tools of the trade, as well as the occasional 1,600-pound armor-piercing bombs for hardened targets. The Germans, on the receiving end of the P-47's attentions, started calling them Yabos, shortened for Jagdbomber, or fighter bomber. M8 bazooka rockets were also used. Jugs could carry 2 M10 triple-tube launchers on each wing, with each tube containing a 4.5-inch M8 rocket for a total of 12 rockets. Once fired, these came off the aircraft at 865 feet per second, were, in quotes, accurate to 800 yards, and carried 5 pounds of explosive that could punch through 1 inch of armor plate and penetrate 1 foot of good reinforced concrete. I put accurate in quotes because none of these aircraft rockets were terribly accurate, and there were many factors that affected whether they were going to go where the pilot wanted them to go. Firstly, there was the skill of the pilot. A new pilot might be used to starting a strafing run by firing his guns early and walking the fire onto the target. Wasteful in ammo, but helpful in aiming. He couldn't do that with the rockets, and he didn't have any special sighting mechanism to help him. And the rockets themselves were unguided, so they couldn't fix any aiming mistakes after they were off the wings. Now, they did stabilize through the use of flip-out fins after they had left the tube. But during their acceleration, they had a wobble. Add to that any pitch, roll, or yaw input by the pilot during the firing, and you had what the Army had to call a barrage weapon. It had a devastating effect, but was anything but precise. An upgrade to the M8 rocket was the High Velocity Aircraft Rocket, or HVAR, also known by the nickname Holy Moses. Although jugs could carry fewer, typically a total of 8 with 4 per wing, they were superior in many ways. They came off the rails at 1,300 feet per second, and were more accurate than the bazookas as they were spin stabilized. Their fins were slightly canted, that means twisted at a small angle, and as the rocket flew, the airflow over the fins made it spin around its longitudinal axis, just like a rifle bullet, keeping it more aerodynamically stable, improving accuracy and consistency for targets hundreds of yards away. This allowed for an accuracy at about 1,000 yards, and once the warhead got there, it had almost 3 pounds more explosive than the M8 rocket and could punch through almost double the armor and 3 times the concrete. All of these weapons were available for D-Day and beyond, and they were absolutely devastating in dismantling the Wehrmacht. According to the Smithsonian, Thunderbolt pilots claimed to have destroyed 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. Now, don't get the idea that the Jugs had completely given up on air-to-air combat. They were even credited for bringing down jets, including 20 Luftwaffe Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters and 4 Arado AR-234 jet bombers in aerial combat. Not bad for an old piston banger with its roots in the 1930s. Late in the war, a new weapon was introduced that is less often associated with World War II, and if it is, it's usually mentioned in the Pacific. This was napalm, and it arrived in Europe in late 1944 to 1945. Napalm A had been developed by MIT, and the word comes from naphthenic palmitic acid, aluminum soaps, and these were mixed in the field with gasoline to produce a jellied product that created a sticky, long-lasting burn. This gel was then loaded into the standard 108-gallon paper or 110-gallon M10 or M15 steel drop tanks that were normally used for fuel. They were found to be very useful against entrenched infantry, villages that had been converted into strongpoints, riverbank defensive positions, forested ambush pockets, and retreating German columns. The technique to drop them was to approach on a shallow dive angle at 20 to 30 degrees, release them at about 200 to 600 feet, and they refused to rupture on impact and scatter burning gel over an area the size of a tennis court, causing an effect described by one Thunderbolt pilot as a, open quotes, rolling sheet of fire that crawled up anything it touched, close quotes. The 9th Air Force often used napalm during breakouts, Falaise, the Siegfried Line, the Ardennes, and the Ruhr Pocket, as it was a fast, terrifying way to clear out defenders with a combined overwhelming effect compared to general-purpose bombs, and had a minimal risk of blast damage to nearby Allied forces. Add to that the Jugs were already doing conventional low-level strafing, and you had a psychological effect that made it pretty darn hard to not cut and run. And that psychological effect worked on the other side too. Just as the enemy was feeling panicky about waves of Jugs flinging rockets and bullets and bombs at them, friendly infantry felt more and more confident about getting up out of cover to finish the job, knowing that they had the Jugs there to soften things up and get them out of scrapes. I remember hearing a story about some tipsy infantry on leave running into some Air Force types. Inter-service rivalry and all, the GIs began the exchange being, somewhat aggressive towards the flyboys, whom they considered to be pansy-ass types, who had fought their war on a 9-to-5 schedule, staying clean and coming back to base in the evening for hot showers and dates with local girls, while the dog faces were slogging their way through the dirt and snow. Things were getting pretty touch and go, as one might say, until the infantry found out that the flyboys were P-47 pilots. Immediately the atmosphere changed, and the infantry types became almost weepy, describing the number of times that the jugs had saved their bacon. Those jug pilots did not pay for their drinks after that. P-47 served everywhere the Americans fought, and even in places where there was no fighting at all, such as holding the line in Alaska. Although I jumped over it to tell the story of the jug in northwestern Europe, before the Thunderbolt became the king of the hedgerows in Normandy, it had to cut its teeth in a very different kind of battlefield, the Mediterranean theater of operations. And let me tell you, this was no gentle introduction. From the deserts of North Africa to the snow-capped peaks of the Alps, the P-47 proved early on that it could take a beating and keep on flying. The first jug units touched down in spring 1943 during the tail end of the North African campaign. Groups like the 57th, 79th, 86th, and the legendary 325th Fighter Group, the Checkertail Clan, were trading in their old P-40s for this hulking radial engine beast. And yes, it looked massive taxiing across the metal PSP runways. But in the dust, heat, and sandstorms of Tunisia, that Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine was worth its weight in gold. Unlike liquid-cooled fighters, this jug didn't boil, vapor lock, or cry out for mercy. By July 1943, the Thunderbolt was part of the Sicily invasion and quickly found its groove. Fighter sweeps, armed reconnaissance, and low-level ground attack. A typical mission? Drop a pair of 500-pound bombs on a bridge, strafe a convoy of German trucks hugging the Sicilian coast, and then escort a flight of medium bombers across the straits, all while dodging hidden flak in olive groves and stone terraces. By the time Salerno rolled around in September, P-47s were already functioning as flying artillery, hammering German tanks, artillery, and entrenched positions supporting the beachhead. Air-to-air action? Oh, absolutely. The Luftwaffe still had a strong presence in Italy, and P-47s tangled with Bf-109s, FW-190s, and even Italian fighters like the Macchi C-205 and Reggiani RE-2001. The Checkertail pilots earned a reputation for diving on enemy formations with a kind of ferocious confidence that made the Thunderbolt look less like a plane and more like an 8-gun freight train in the sky. Then came Anzio, January 1944, a nasty little pocket of fighting that required round-the-clock air support. Jugs flew 6 to 8 sorties a day, pounding German artillery lines, strafing tank columns, and blasting supply trucks, attempting to break the beachhead. The air was alive with tracers, smoke, and the constant roar of radial engines pushing through flak-filled skies. Monte Cassino followed, and the mountains of Italy presented a new challenge. Pilots were tasked with cratering roads, railways, and bunkers carved into the cliffs, often flying just feet above the ground. The P-47's toughness showed here more than anywhere else. Flak holes, shredded control surfaces, and partially shot-off cylinders weren't enough to bring a jug down. It just kept on flying. By late 1944, the Thunderbolt was practically owning the battlefield. From Florence to the Po Valley, it was interdicting rail lines, blowing up river barges and pontoon bridges, and strafing retreating German convoys. The jug's reputation as a close air support workhorse was cemented in the hills, valleys, and villages of northern Italy. And as the Allies pushed into Austria, Yugoslavia, and the Brenner Pass, the P-47's combination of firepower, durability, and range allowed it to strike deep into German logistics networks. Trains, depots, armored vehicles. If it moved, the Thunderbolt could find it and destroy it. Pilots returned from these missions often describing their jugs as safe enough to fly home with a few holes that you could walk through. So, warbirders, the Mediterranean wasn't just a stop on the jug's way to glory in Europe, it was the proving ground. Every dive, every bomb run, every strafing pass honed the Thunderbolt into the rugged, fearsome aircraft that would later dominate Normandy and beyond. It was in these sun-baked, flak-filled skies that the P-47 earned its reputation, a flying arsenal, tough as nails, and absolutely unafraid of a fight. Now, because the P-47 is such a stereotypical, in quotes, American plane, you know, big, brash, loud, in your face, and a little over the top, I had started out these episodes thinking that it wasn't used by too many other countries. Boy, was I wrong. The RAF received 240 Razorback P-47Ds, which they called Thunderbolt Mark I, and 590 bubble-top P-47Ds designated Thunderbolt Mark II. With high-altitude interception less of a priority, the Brits quickly realized the Thunderbolt excelled at ground attack missions. By 1944, RAF Thunderbolts were deployed against the Japanese in Burma, flying out of India with 16 squadrons under Southeast Asia Command. They acted as air support for Army operations, often held in reserve as cab rank fighters, ready to strike enemy positions, airfields, and supply lines on call. In the final months of the war, Thunderbolts proved devastating alongside Spitfires during the Japanese breakout at the Siteng Bend. These aircraft carried 3 500-pound bombs, or in some missions, British 60-pound RP-3 rockets, and long-range tanks allowed up to 5 hours of endurance. They also escorted RAF Liberators during the bombing of Rangoon. Squadrons that weren't disbanded eventually transitioned to British-built fighters like the Hawker Tempest, marking the end of the Jugs chapter in RAF service. The Free French Air Forces operated 446 P-47Ds beginning in 1943. These aircraft saw action in France and Germany, and later on in the 1950s in Algeria. And here's a TDIL, or Today I Learned, tidbit of information that makes me embarrassed to call myself an amateur aviation historian. And I'll apologize right away to any Brazilian listeners out there. Do I have any Brazilian listeners? I don't even know. If you're out there, reach out to say hi. Okay, all the rest of you listeners. Did you know that Brazil fought on the Allied side? I know, neither did I. And did you know that the 1st Fighter Squadron of the Força Aérea Brasileira, Brazilian Air Force 1st Fighter Squadron, flew P-47Ds in combat over northern Italy and Central Europe from November 1944 to May 1945? Me neither. They flew 445 missions and earned the Presidential Unit Citation by the American government in recognition for its achievements in World War II. I know. Mind blown. I also did not realize at all that the Mexican Escuadrón Aéreo de Pelea 201, 201st Fighter Squadron, flew P-47Ds as part of the U.S. 5th Air Force in the Philippines. They flew 791 sorties against Japanese forces. About 200 Jugs were sent to the USSR via Lend-Lease. They were used for high-altitude air defenses over major cities, and they were not used for ground attack, with the Soviets preferring their own homegrown Ilyushin IL-2s. Iran bought 50 in 1948. The Italian Air Force bought 100 in 1950. Peru operated 56 until 1963. Yugoslavia bought 150 in 1952. The Turkish Air Force operated 180 from 1948 until 1954. A dozen or more other countries operated them also. After the war, the Chinese Nationalist Air Force received about 100. These actually clashed with 5 P-47Ds that had been captured by the Chinese Communist forces. As for the USAAF, With the close of World War II, orders for 6,000 additional P-47s were cancelled. The Jug was renamed the F-47 in 1947 and served with the United States Air Force, USAF, until 1949, and with the Air National Guard until being retired in 1953. The F-47 was not deployed to Korea for the Korean War, although perhaps it should have been. The USAF and Air National Guard used their North American F-51 Mustangs mainly in the close air support role, and many were lost to anti-aircraft fire. Maybe it would have been better to send in the Jugs? I had promised you some info on a couple of variants that were attempts to extend the life of the Jug. With the XP-47H, Republic installed a 2,300 horsepower Chrysler 16-cylinder inverted V engine in two P-47D airframes in late 1943. The resulting XP-47H had a strangely pointy, new streamlined nose with a large intake and was expected to have a maximum speed of 490 miles per hour. But by the time the aircraft modifications were complete in 1945, the jets were coming and the XP-47H project was cancelled. The XP-47J was another attempt to improve performance by reducing weight, for example by dropping down to 6 guns instead of 8, and swapping in a 2,800 horsepower R2800 57C engine, wrapped in a sleek, streamlined cowling. It became the first piston-engined fighter to exceed 500 miles per hour with a speed of 504 miles per hour, making it the fastest Thunderbolt variant ever. The XP-72 was a prototype fighter interceptor developed by Republic as a progression of the P-47 Thunderbolt design. It was built around the Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp Major 28-cylinder air-cooled radial engine, the very same one used to power the Boeing B-50 Superfortress and Convair B-36. Instead of the turbocharger in the back, it had a supercharger mounted behind the pilot, which was driven by an extension shaft from the engine, kind of in the reverse of the Airacobra. Armament would have consisted of 6 50 cals with underwing racks for 2 1,000-pound bombs. Or it could have been armed with 2 37mm M4 autocannon with 4 50s or 4 M4 autocannon. It was cancelled after 2 prototypes for the same reason as the XP-47J, which was, the jets were coming. Well, if you can't beat the jets, what about joining them? The very last P-47 variant was a project to do just that. The idea was to stick a General Electric J31 centrifugal compressor turbojet engine with 1,650 pounds of thrust into the aircraft in place of the big radial. It was thought that because of the large diameter of the P-47's existing fuselage, it could handle the fat jet engine, but it would not. So next, they tried the Allison J35, which produced about 4,000 pounds of thrust. This engine would also soon power the Republic F-84 Thunderjet and Northrop F-89 Scorpion. The new kids on the block trying to elbow out the Jug. The radial was removed, and the intake for the J35 unit went through a curved duct assembly running under the cockpit floor. The J35 would be located under the pilot's position, promoting a taller fuselage than even the original P-47. The turbojet exhaust exited through a port under the tail fin. The guns were relocated to the nose for better concentrated firepower. The rest of the Jug was to be left pretty much as is. However, this paper project didn't get far enough even for a formal name or model designator, let alone a prototype. although I will post the concept drawings on the Patreon so that we can all at least dream of a jet power jug. The P-47 was flown by many famous pilots, but there's one that just can't be ignored and who showed the value of being stubborn, although not too stubborn. Born in 1919 to Polish immigrant parents in Oil City, Pennsylvania, Francis Stanley Gabi Gabreski grew up in a family that worked hard in their store, dreaming big for their son, including sending him off to Notre Dame in 1938. It wasn't smooth sailing at first. Gabi was not a good student and almost failed his freshman year. Gabi struggled academically, but he was bitten by the bug and he wanted to fly. He took his first flying lessons in a Taylor Cub, clocking just 6 hours in the air, and he was as good of a pilot as he had been an academic. I mean, not very good. According to his instructor, he just didn't, in quotes, have the touch. But Gabi was good at one thing, being persistent. In 1939, he enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps as an aviation cadet and trained on Stearmans, Vultee BT-13s, and AT-6 Texans. He wasn't a stellar cadet either and was almost washed out, being forced to pass an elimination check ride during primary, even to continue his training. But by March 1941, he had actually earned his wings and a second lieutenant's commission, sailing off to Hawaii to join the 45th Pursuit Squadron at Wheeler Field. He trained on P-36 Hawks and P-40 Warhawks, met his future wife, Kay Cochran, and even scrambled against the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor along with several members of his squadron, in flying P-36 fighters in an attempt to intercept the attackers, but the Japanese were already gone. While training on newer models of P-40s and Bell P-39 Airacobras, he was also watching the heroic efforts of the Polish squadrons in the Battle of Britain. Their exploits inspired him, and Gabi offered to serve as a Polish-speaking liaison to the Polish squadrons in the RAF, wanting to learn from their combat experiences. By January 1943, he was flying the Supermarine Spitfire Mark IV with number 315 Polish Squadron. Gabreski flew 20 missions with the Poles, finally engaging in combat over the Channel on February 3rd when a group of Focke-Wulf FW-190s jumped his squadron. Too excited to shoot at anything effectively, it seemed that Gabreski was no good at that either. Then came the aircraft that would define his career, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Gabi joined the 56th Fighter Group at RAF Halesworth in February 1943, quickly becoming a flight leader, and eventually the commander of the 61st Fighter Squadron. He wasn't the most popular at first. Jumping over senior pilots and speaking his mind earned him some resentment, but he quickly proved himself in the air. On August 24, 1943, Gabi scored his first kill, an FW-190 near Dreux, France, and the legend began. By November, he became an ace while covering B-17 bombers over Bremen, even surviving a close call when a 20mm shell lodged in his engine without exploding, but destroying the turbocharger. Even though he was low on fuel and ammo, and with a dead engine, he outmaneuvered the Bf-109 until he had glided down to a lower altitude where his now unturbocharged engine could restart and run, and then he got home. The classic jug toughness saving the day. Gabi's tally climbed through 1943 and into 1944. By May 22, 1944, he shot down 3 FW-190s over Germany in a single mission, tying for the top ace spot in the 8th Air Force. By July, he became America's leading ace in the European theater, surpassing Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record with 28 confirmed aerial kills. He also destroyed 3 more aircraft on the ground. Gabby's stubbornness had sure paid off for him, but it nearly ruined him on July 20th, 1944. Gabreski had reached the 300-hour combat time limit for 8th Air Force fighter pilots and was cooling his heels, just waiting for transport back to the United States on leave and to marry Kay Cochran. But instead of boarding the transport plane that day, he decided to hop back into the 5th of his P-47s, he never named any of them, in order to, fly just one more bomber escort mission to Rüsselsheim, Germany. Okay, so that was taking a chance, but couldn't he just take it easy on the way back? No. He saw some Heinkel HE-111s parked on the airfield at Nijmegen, Germany, and dove his jug in on the deck to attack. One strafing pass was plenty enough to tempt fate, but Gabby's stubbornness didn't just tempt fate, he cheekily tweaked fate's nose by turning in for another pass. When his tracers were passing over the parked bomber that he was aiming at, he dropped the nose of his Thunderbolt even more to adjust. The old aviation saying is that you need 2 of the following 3 things to keep flying: airspeed, altitude, or brains. It could be argued that Gabby, at this point, only had airspeed. He was so out of altitude that his jug's propeller actually clipped the runway, bending the tips back. The damage caused his engine to vibrate violently, and even the legendary jug was not able to bring him back this time. He was forced to crash land, and Gabreski then ran into the nearby woods, where he eluded capture for 5 days. After being apprehended, he was sent to Stalag Luft 1. For him, the war was over. Later, he would become a jet ace in Korea and continue serving the Air Force with distinction. But it was with the Thunderbolt in Europe that he had cemented his legend. Our last profile of a pilot will lead us directly to a surviving jug that can be seen in the flesh, aluminum, at the U.S. Air Force Museum. If Gabby Gabreski was the ace of Europe, then Colonel Neil Kirby was one of the first Thunderbolt legends in the Pacific Theater. Born in Wichita Falls, Kansas in 1911, Kirby grew up in the Lone Star State, graduated from Arlington High School in 1928, and earned a business degree from North Texas Agricultural College in 1936. But the boardroom was not his destiny. The sky was calling. He joined the Army Air Corps in 1937, trained at Randolph and Kelly Fields, and served with pursuit squadrons in Michigan and the Panama Canal Zone, flying P-39 Airacobras. By October 1942, Kirby was a major, tasked with commanding the newly formed 348th Fighter Group at Westover Field in Massachusetts. After months of P-47 training, he and his group shipped out to Australia in June 1943, ready to take the fight to the Japanese. The P-47's turbocharged engine and rugged airframe were perfect for the Pacific. Kirby's pilots learned to exploit the Thunderbolt's strengths: climb to high altitude over the target, dive on the enemy, and unleash 850 caliber machine guns on lightly armored Japanese aircraft. Kirby opened his score on September 4, 1943, downing a Mitsubishi G4M and a Nakajima Ki-43, and then added a Mitsubishi Ki-46 10 days later. By September 23, he was promoted to colonel. Kirby flew a string of aircraft named after his wife Virginia, all bearing the proud moniker Fiery Ginger, from Fiery Ginger 1 through 4. But it was October 11, 1943 that would etch his name in history. Leading just 4 P-47s on a sweep over Wewak, Kirby ran into 40 Japanese fighters. In an hour of intense combat, he shot down 6 aircraft himself, 4 Ki-43s and 2 Ki-61s, while his wingmen added 3 more. That made him the first P-47 ace of the Pacific Theater and set a US AAF record for the most victories in a single mission. For this heroic feat, General George Kenney recommended him for the Medal of Honor, which he received from none other than General Douglas MacArthur in January 1944. The record would later be surpassed, but Kirby's daring mission remains iconic. Even after being transferred to headquarters duties, Kirby kept flying combat missions whenever he could. He was in a quiet race with Richard Bong for the title of leading American ace in the Pacific. By March 1944, he had 21 confirmed kills, a tally few could match. Tragically, on March 5, 1944, Kirby took off in Fiery Ginger 4 on a patrol over Wewak. After downing a Ki-48, he was attacked by a Ki-43 and his Thunderbolt went down into the jungle. Witnesses on the ground saw him parachute, but he became tangled in a tree and succumbed to his injuries. His remains were recovered in 1947 and positively identified in 1949, finally laid to rest in Sparkman Hillcrest Memorial Park Cemetery. 15,686 P-47s were produced, and even though the P-47 was a survivor, war is a rough business. And about 5,222 of these aircraft were lost throughout the conflict, although 1,723 of those are attributed to accidents not related to combat. Due to the Jug serving in so many air forces, static museum pieces can be seen everywhere, such as Fiery Ginger 4. Unfortunately, the RCAF never operated the P-47, so I've never actually seen one in person. Next time I get down to the States, I'll have to get to a museum that has one. One recent registry lists about 58 complete P-47 airframes worldwide. These would be airworthy, static, or under restoration. Somewhere around 18 aircraft are listed as airworthy, although that number, of course, can change by the day. One airworthy example that you can see is a P-47D painted up with the interesting name of Chief Sky-Yuma and located at Fagan Fighters in Granite Falls, Minnesota. The plane with this name was flown by Lieutenant Dwayne Buchholz, who was from Ortonville, Minnesota, and who served in the 405th Squadron, 9th Air Force. The chief's face was painted by Sergeant Eli Gutierrez, based on the image on an Indian nickel, which was also known as the Buffalo nickel, a U.S. 5-cent coin minted from 1913 to 1938. Lieutenant Buchholz seems like a real character who wanted to take this theme to the limit. In the usual fashion, he had his own name painted beneath the cockpit as the pilot, but added Chief of the Sioux to that. Then, to bring the joke to its logical end, he displayed his crew chief's name as Sergeant L.C. Wilson, Chief of the Crew. Buchholz went through 3 aircraft named Chief Sky-Yuma, and no, it was not the name of a real indigenous chief. He got the name from the University of Minnesota's cheer used at their football games. Supposedly the word sky is a Sioux battle cry meaning victory, and the Yuma rhymes with, rah rah rah. Among the surviving Jugs, few have lived a longer, stranger, or more hard-won life than P-47D, serial number 4549192. The warbird we know today as Nellie B. She rolled off the Evansville line in the summer of 1945, too late for combat, and spent the end of the war shuttled between Air Training Command and storage depots like Tinker Field. For most Thunderbolts, that would have been the end of the story, but this particular Jug got a second life. In 1952, she was pulled out of storage, rebuilt, and shipped under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program to the Peruvian Air Force, where she served as a frontline fighter and later as a trainer. By the time Peru retired its Thunderbolts in the late 1960s, she had logged a longer active military career than many combat veteran jugs. Returning to the United States in 1969, she entered the civilian warbird world just as interest in World War II aircraft was beginning to surge. Registered as November 47 Delta Delta, she was restored to airworthy condition and flew on the American Airshow circuit, until disaster struck in 1980 when an engine failure forced a crash landing short of a runway in Tulsa. The wreck was ugly, and for a while it looked like this jug's flying days were over. But if we've learned anything from this series, it is that Thunderbolts are hard to kill. The Hulk was purchased, painstakingly rebuilt from the ground up, and by 1985 she was back in the air, wearing a new paint scheme, a new life, and eventually a new home. In 1986, she finally crossed the Atlantic to join the fighter collection at Duxford, where she flew for decades, cycling through several historically accurate paint schemes and carrying names like No Guts, No Glory, before finally becoming Nellie B of the 492nd Fighter Squadron, 48th Fighter Group, her current identity. The legend of the P-47 lives on. When Republic resumed building military aircraft, it included Thunder in the names, giving us the Thunderjet, Thunderstreak, Thunderflash, and Thunderchief. Republic Aviation was acquired by Fairchild in July of 1965 and was sadly no longer an independent company. But when Fairchild came up with a new, heavily armed, heavily armored ground attack aircraft called the A-10, they honored it with the resurrected name of Thunderbolt II, and it first flew in May 1972. Lastly, Boeing's successor to the F-22 Raptor has been named F-47, somehow skipping 8 numbers from what should have been the next number, F-36. Let's just think that the real reason for skipping all these numbers is a nod to the legendary Thunderbolt P-47. Although, as we warbirders know, they were renamed to F-47 themselves, which one day might lead to some confusion. But that will be a problem for another day, and another podcaster, as this newbie, F-47, is most definitely out of my era. Whew. I hope that you have enjoyed my approach to covering the P-47. As a trend, I think I've been diving deeper than I used to. I mean, I did the entire stable of BF-109s in a single episode, and I definitely could have spent more time with the Mesa. So what do you think? Have I gone too far in digging and stretching things out? Or have I hit a Goldilocks level of just right? Please let me know in the comments. Thanks again to my Patreon supporters. You'll be getting a bonus with another lesser-known Republic product that really caught my eye during the research. So Happy New Year again, and until next time.